Hi, welcome to the Professional Investment Podcast. I'm Charlotte Moore, award-winning journalist and co-founder of Moore Square Communications. Each episode, we welcome a guest to the show to share their news story of the week. And I'm delighted to welcome Tony English, head of LGPS Investment at Mercer, to the show. Welcome, Tony.
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Great to have you on the show. Do tell us, what is your news story of the week?
Okay, so my news story of the week came out in the FT, and the title, as shown up here, Canadian pension funds to exit UK's biggest port operator in a potentially £10 billion deal.
And do tell us, why did you choose that as your news story of the week?
It's nothing to do with either the company involved or the owners. It's just it just really kind of illustrates one of the key motivations, I think, for the government in a number of their reforms at the moment, that with regard to pensions in particular, where there's just pressure from, I think, the government for UK pension funds to invest more domestically. And you've got basically a company there worth around about £10 billion. The article suggests it's over 90% of that company. It's a privately owned company. Over 90% of that company is currently owned by overseas pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. So very little by way of, if any, by way of UK pension funds. And it's also, it's clearly it's both a national asset, but it's also a very local asset in that it has 21 ports around England, Wales and Scotland, and even a rail freight terminal in the West Midlands. So I think particularly interesting that some of the pension funds that own that company, that the pools will be approaching, in fact, exceeding the size of those those pension funds. So I just think it's kind of a very timely article with everything that's going on in terms of the LGPS Fit for the Future, but also the Mansion House Accord, etc.
Yes, as you mentioned, we do have the Fit for the Future reforms going through. And last week, I spent quite a bit of time talking about that with David Walker. And as part of those Fit for the Future reforms, there's an obligation by the government for local pension schemes, LGPS pension schemes, to invest around £1 billion locally. And they're expected to start showing their plans to the government by the 1st of September. I think that's correct. I mean, obviously, let's not forget, as you say, the LGPS already invests quite heavily in its local areas. So how is that going to change, do you think, from the 1st of September and into the future?
Yeah, but just firstly on the question, so I think important to remember that, yes, there's under the draft guidance that's currently was recently consulted on, there's a requirement for funds to have a target for local investments. But the funds are very much responsible for what that target is, what level that target is. And it could, in theory, be zero. So there's not an obligation to invest anything locally, but clearly the expectation is, and as you rightly say, Charlotte, many funds already have significant investments either in the UK wide or locally. So I think the key difference in the new world, assuming, of course, this is all, the pension schemes bill still needs to get royal assent. We need to see the final guidance, etc. But for me, I think the key difference from the current arrangements is that kind of intentionality, that there will be a requirement to set a local target. And to the extent that a fund does actually set a target greater than zero, then there's clearly an intentionality there to have local investments, however that's defined, as opposed to just corporate UK-wide investments.
Yeah, we touched on last week how you define local when you have 6 pools instead of 8, with lots of different local authorities from all around the country, and there isn't such an obvious kind of local area. What do you think some of the biggest challenges are going to be for those pools and for the partner funds when they try to come up with how they're going to invest locally?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I should say, I was very pleased. I've actually printed out the guidance, so I get the draft guidance, so I get the wordings exactly right here. I was very pleased to see in the draft guidance under the following wording, that UK-wide investment is encouraged, but local investment should be local to the fund or pool. And then while a target area should not be the whole of the UK, it is recognised that local investments can be made as part of a UK-wide strategy. So there's some flexibility
Okay.
there, and I think that's the key question. How will pools and the funds interpret that? Because clearly one way you could do this, which actually some of the funds already do, is if they have, some of the pools already do, is that if you have a UK fund that invests across the UK, you could then perhaps have side pockets, sidecars, where you kind of co-invest in the local area as and when the UK-wide strategy identifies opportunities in the local area. But yes, I mean, it definitely does create a degree of complexity, particularly, of course, if different funds come to different conclusions as to what they define as local. So, is local, do they keep it simple and go to the kind of maximum geography under the guidance is the geography of the pool? But of course, you can get smaller than that, either across strategic authorities, all the way down to the administrative authority. So that kind of choice, which obviously I think is quite right, that the funds have choice in how they define local, to the extent that that's different, could present some challenges. And yeah, I mean, I think a key question will be, as I say, whether you start from the perspective of a UK-wide strategy, which can then kind of have outsized allocations locally, whether you actually start from a local strategy. Do you actually literally start looking to identify local opportunities, which you then kind of package together in different ways for your partner funds? And then, obviously, to the extent that you have co-investments, then co-investments should not be underestimated. Mercer, we do co-investments on behalf of our clients. To do co-investments, you clearly need significant in-house resource to be able to assess those co-investment opportunities, and to assess those thoroughly, but also quickly. Because of course, some of these deals, to actually get them across the line, you have to throw it almost like effectively it's kind of an M&A transaction. You've got to throw a lot of time and effort at that to assess whether or not it's an appropriate opportunity. So a whole new kind of resourcing and infrastructure around doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that, as you say, that wording from the government gives quite a lot of leeway to the pools and to the partner funds, and they could almost have a sort of 3-tier system, like hyper-local, local at a pool level, and then also nationally as well. Because, I mean, I can understand why the government's done it, because they don't want to sort of cut the pools off from investing in national infrastructure, like the AB Port story that we started with, or even the national grid, or even some kind of wind or solar power energy. So it does seem to give a lot of flexibility across that. And you could have these very detailed definitions of local. Do you think we could get to that level of sophistication of hyperlocal, pool local, and then national as well amongst the pools?
Yeah, yes. I mean, as I say, this is evolving, and these are live conversations between the pools and their partner funds as to how they want to, excuse me, as to how they want to define that. In my experience so far, actually, the funds that I work with have been kind of broadly happy to have kind of broader definitions of local. But we'll have to see how that evolves. And yeah, it's a challenge. And obviously, the more local you get, the more you can, perhaps there might be concerns about kind of conflicts between between perhaps mayoral authorities and local and the partner funds, etc.
And when we think of local investment, we always tend to think of infrastructure, don't we? We think of railways, or, as I alluded to before, green energy, or bridges, or buildings, social housing, hospitals. But local investment can be more than that, can't it? It could be about encouraging the local economy, encouraging small businesses within the local economy. I mean, for example, where I live in Hammersmith and Fulham, we have Old Oak Common that's been completely redeveloped. And as part of that, there's been Imperial College have moved into Hammersmith and Fulham. There's been an effort by the council to create an area where small business and tech companies can thrive and can grow. Do we see that kind of thinking beginning to come into how the government and the LGPS are thinking about local investment, or even things like reinvigorating high streets that are dying? It's something a bit more sophisticated than just the physical infrastructure.
Yeah, obviously in terms of kind of local economic growth, I think there's definitely been lots of progress in thinking, particularly kind of direct lending strategies, for example, for SMEs. So I've seen a number of fund managers actually develop propositions whereby they have a lending book across the UK and they're happy to carve out local opportunities there, to actually support local businesses in growth. And also in terms of private equity, in the kind of the original next steps on investments consultation, lose track of time now, was that 2-3 years ago? That highlighted some examples, actually some of which Mercer were involved in some of those deals, whereby you actually had regional private equity strategies to kind of generate to spur local growth. And of course, around universities, we've seen various development of propositions and investments in kind of spin outs of universities. So I think there is a really kind of interesting, there's just a big conversation going on at the moment, I think. So there's been between investors, asset owners, and not, of course, just LGPS. I know we'll talk about this perhaps a bit more later, but the much broader kind of spectrum of private capital. And obviously some of the strategic authorities are still kind of working out exactly how they're going to bring propositions to the pools, but and I know some are more developed than others in that thinking. But absolutely, I'm sure kind of development agencies and ways that you can kind of. I was reading an interesting article the other day about the arc from Oxford to Cambridge. Like kind of lots of thinking around that. But yeah, it's a very broad conversation, and I certainly don't. Hands up, I'm no expert. But it is fascinating. I'm kind of getting more stuck into the weeds now. I've had some conversations with some strategic authorities who are trying to work out how they should approach this, because I think it is a very kind of new world. But very interesting. And there's, as we know, there's lots of opportunities. The UK has a lot of funding needs across the spectrum of, as you say, not just infrastructure, but economic, healthcare, etc., transport. Really interesting.
Well, you mentioned their venture capital, and you talked about, sort of alluded to it there, but if we think about the LGPS, and we think about another pot of pension capital, DC funds, master trust, GPPs, in many ways they have more similarities than differences, don't they? Because they're both investing multi-decades into the future. There's no endpoint. There's no time when they'll be finished paying out. They should carry on in perpetuity. So the range of their investments should be similar. Their CIOs should be having similar conversations and similar thought processes about how they want to construct that portfolio for the future. So how do we how can we tie together that sort of very broad definition of local investment you and I have cooked up between us, between sort of like the hyper-local, the pool local, the national local, and going beyond infrastructure and thinking about local economy, which sort of pushes into the Mansion House Accord? How do you see that kind of developing? And would we even see in the future agreements between, say, an LGPS pool and a DC fund to co-invest together?
Yeah, and so I think this is where I think this is really, really important, because to the extent that the government strategy is about consolidating assets so that bigger asset owners can do more interesting things, then really the more we can align the LGPS with DC, with insurers, so they're looking at the same deals, I think that's more powerful. And that's another reason why that's one of the reasons I chose this article for the week, because it's that really interesting mix of national and local. So, depending on how the pools look at local, if you do look top down and say, okay, I'm happy to have a nationwide strategy from which I will allocate to, but I will then perhaps do co-investments more locally, then that's great. That means they're fishing in the same pond as perhaps some of the master trusts, some of the insurers. But if it's bottom up and they say, well, we're going to focus on single local investment opportunities, well, obviously the article of the week, as I said, that's a portfolio of ports around the country that would be applicable to the master trusts of the world, but perhaps wouldn't be applicable to the LGPSs of the world. And certainly I've seen from my own experience, the LGPS and the DC world start to come together, actually. So one of the funds that I advised on that one of my local authority funds actually seeded, they anchored the funds, which was an energy transition funds. They anchored that investment about 3 years ago. One of the master trusts went into that funds just last year. So there have definitely been examples of investors coming together. And actually, in preparing for today's podcast, I came across, this is a bit esoteric, but I think it's really...
We are the podcast home for the esoteric, Tony.
Okay, so this really illustrates the point, actually. So it's called HARP, HARP. So it's I'm probably going to get the acronym wrong now. So it's the Haweswater Aqueduct Resiliency Plan. So you've basically got, Haweswater's that man-made reservoir in the Lake District, which I've walked around.
Hasn't the PPF invested in that?
Yes, so you're stealing my thunder, Charlotte.
Sorry.
So the reason I like this project is, obviously water's a very topical subject, but the problem with water, of course, is it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time to fix things. So, and HARP really illustrates that. So HARP is a 9-year project to replace the pipelines from the Haweswater Reservoir to the likes of Greater Manchester, Lancashire, Cumbria. That's a £3 billion project, going to take 9 years. And funding has come from a whole range of pension fund sources. So I believe GLIL are an investor. And of course, that's an example of cross-pool collaboration, which I think is something perhaps I'll touch on later. But you've got GLIL in there, you've got a master trust in there. I think it's Nest. And you've got some of the insurers in there as well. And you've got the PPF. So there's a great example. Now, of course, that is a very local strategy, which I guess is probably one of the reasons GLIL were attracted to it, given, of course, their partner funds. But, of course, it's also been one that's been of interest to those other entities I mentioned. And, this is perhaps another example. One of my favourite infrastructure projects I often talk about at conferences is the Thames Tideway Tunnel. That's one that two of the clients I worked with at the time, 10 years ago, and I think about 2 million pensioners, assets of 2 million pensioners were helped, went towards to help that project. That was a £5 billion project that took 10 years to build. And I think so far it went live about a year ago and has so far diverted around 15 million tonnes of mixed sewage and rainwater. Has diverted that instead of going into the Thames, that's gone into the Thames Tideway Tunnel to then be treated at the sewage works. So, really very relevant to a public need, but also just shows how expensive and how time consuming these projects can be. But yeah, some really exciting examples now of how the pensions ecosystem is starting to join forces to do more interesting things.
Yeah, Thames Tideway Tunnel is good for me too, because I live in London, obviously in the Thames water catchment area, and my street regularly floods when there's too much water. So Tony, if you haven't gone away and watched the documentary about the building of the Thames Tideway Tunnel, I expect you to do that.
I've already watched it. Yeah, so available on all good streaming platforms.
Fellow geeks unite, right? Tunnel geeks. I've also watched the one about the Crossrail as well. So yes, London infrastructure geek here.
Do you remember? Do you remember what the self-cleaning velocity is?
No, I don't remember what the self-cleaning velocity is, but I have a feeling.
I'm not going to say anything more on this podcast, but that's something that people can Google. It's quite, it's obviously a big civil engineering project, and I did an asset tour 10 years ago when they were just starting the construction phase, and that was a new phrase I learned: self-cleaning velocity.
It was interesting what you say though about being able to join up different bits of different money across the different pots of capital, because one of the things about us now having 4 pots of capital rather than just one is each pot of capital is very tightly defined in how they can invest in terms of the regulatory environment, the competitive environment they're operating. So sometimes if you're an asset manager, you're trying to sell to somebody, it can be difficult to sell, say, the same product across all pots of capital. And I wondered if there's a way, you mentioned insurers there and you mentioned the PPF. So if we think about insurers, not as a DC provider, but a classic insurer investing in, say, a life or an annuity business or BPA, the assets of BPA, then their criteria is going to be quite tightly defined around, it's going to be related to fixed income. They're going to have very tight constraints around cost of capital. Is there a way that different pots of capital could almost fund the whole sort of side of the balance sheet, if you see what I mean, that some people like DC and LGPS might be more happy to go in at an equity side, and insurers might be happier to go in at a fixed income side, or even at different stages of the project, that maybe DC and LGPS come in a bit earlier when it's a bit riskier, and then when it's kind of a guaranteed income, inflation linked, etc., maybe the insurers come in a bit later. Is that how we could start to see this develop, rather than just different pots going into the same investment vehicle?
Yeah, no, I mean, in many ways, I think Thames Tideway Tunnel is an example of how that's already happened or happening. In that, for Thames Tideway Tunnel, there was you had equity investors, but you also had the debt investors, and the debt investors, because they're inflation linked bonds called the Basel Jets bonds. They're inflation linked, and therefore those bonds were of interest to both mature DB schemes who were looking for inflation linked income but with a credit premium, but also to life to insurers as well, for annuity business. So absolutely, I think that there's good examples of how that's worked in the past, and should and could work in the future. But of course, it's not just how private capital; it's also how that private capital then comes alongside public capital, be that in the National Wealth Fund, or and also how the risk sharing works, and the extent to which government can obviously provide potentially backstops for perhaps there's some degree of cost sharing for any overruns, but then there's an ultimate backstop from government to look to avoid to help crowd in private capital.
Yeah, so that could be really interesting. I never thought about that before. It's not like we don't have a lot of infrastructure that we need to build in the UK, and a lot to do for the economy on the venture capital side. So if we could always see all four pots of capital really kind of pull together, that could be very, very interesting in the future, couldn't it?
It absolutely could. But I think another point I continually look to make is that the reality is that the UK's funding needs are so great, but whilst UK pensions can absolutely play their part, but the UK is still going to be very dependent on external capital as well. So this isn't just about making investments attractive to UK pension funds. You have to make them attractive to international investors as well, because the funding needs are huge. I mean, just for there's various reports I've been reading up on recently, but you're looking at least £50 billion plus kind of private capital needing to come in just to the regulated industries of kind of energy, electricity, water, etc. As I said, you just look at that HARP project alone. That's pipes just from Haweswater and the lakes to the urban areas around there. That's a £3 billion project, and that's just one. The needs are huge, and so yes, absolutely. Let's use where appropriate, where we can find attractive, because we have to remember all of these investors have got fiduciary duty, and so the projects need to be sufficiently attractive for them to invest. But absolutely, there's some great examples of how then the UK pensions can kind of join forces to seed new investments, but ultimately that, and then crowd in external investments. But clearly, those investments need to work for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And the point is the UK is not alone in having to build all this new infrastructure. Like every country in the world actually is in a similar position, because we've had sort of, a lot of people have had underinvestment too. Some people have been better than others. But as we sort of have the switch to newer, greener technologies, that's going to have to happen around the world. So we are going to be in competition with other countries for those investments, aren't we?
That absolutely. So I think just for the grid, I think it was National Audit Office estimated the grid needs about £40 billion per annum invested over the next 10 plus years, into both kind of increase the generation capacity, but also the transmission capabilities. And I guess obviously the difference is that, and I'm no economist, but the difference, of course, is that the UK, we already have a significant kind of debt burden, and a tax base. And so, some other countries may be in perhaps a slightly better position in that they can perhaps fund some more of this from the state. But absolutely in the UK, it's got to be a joint effort between the public and private sector. And the government's national infrastructure strategy, the Treasury's infrastructure strategy clearly sets that out. It needs public and private working together.
So we've gone very, very big picture, and we've talked about how all the different pension pots could work together in the future. Let's come back down to just the LGPS again. And obviously we're going through all these fit for the future reforms at the moment. Once the dust has settled on all of us, once the 8 pools have been consolidated into 6 and the new responsibilities of providing principal investment advice have been taken on board, would you think in, say, realistically 2 to 3 years' time, the pools will be able to do that they can't do now? Is it take everything in-house, or is it do more sophisticated things, or is it increase the granularity of their universe? What are you looking forward to? What are you excited about, given all those changes?
So I've got no doubt that more will be done in-house to varying degrees. I've also got no doubt that there'll be cycles to that, and that and there obviously there's well-known examples both in the UK actually and overseas where in-house teams have been closed down. So there's always there's always cycles to these things, and clearly if you want to attract and retain professionals to do, for example, co-investments in infrastructure, etc., you need to keep them not just. You don't need to just attract them financially. You also need just intellectually. They need to have that deal flow just to keep them occupied and interested. And of course, I think we do need to be careful that I think the original Fit for the Future reference, perhaps if 5% of the LGPS went into local investments, that would be £20 billion. But let's say that happens. Once that £20 billion is in the ground for projects like let's say HARP, that's got a 9-year build structure. Once it's in the ground, that is it's then invested. It's not there to be invested again next year. So that deal flow, I think, is really important. And so I do wonder if you might get more consolidation. Sorry, not consolidation. Collaboration. Need to be very careful with my words. Collaboration between the pools in terms of those capabilities. But also, I really do think that there's an important role for external investment managers here to kind of really, to the extent that you want, is it efficient? Let's say we're looking at infrastructure co-investments. Is it really efficient for the pool to develop in-house expertise, for the DC Master Trust to do that, for the Sovereign Wealth Fund to do that, for the insurers to do that? Is it not possibly the case that there's also a role still for external managers to have that expertise, which can then be accessed by all of those different asset owners? Is that not more efficient, a more efficient way of attracting the relevant staff? But we'll, as I say, I think we'll see a mix, and it'll be very interesting how that evolves. But I definitely think we'll see more collaboration between the pools, but also between those different types of asset owner, LGPS, DC, DB that's running off, closed DB that's running off, insurers, and more co-investments and direct stakes. So I think obviously it'll be a very interesting time, but don't underestimate how much still needs to be done by the pools on other issues as well. And the pools have limited bandwidth, and they're having to very carefully prioritise what they're doing as time goes on. So I kind of agree with your timescale as well, that this is going to take a number of years to kind of play out. I mean, by my estimate, you've basically got about £100 billion that needs to move around to kind of effect the consolidation from 8 down to 6 pools.
Okay, well, I think that is a great place for us to end the podcast. Thank you so much for being a guest, Tony. You've been absolutely superb. It's been a great discussion, really interesting, and taken us in a direction that we haven't really touched on before. So that's always very exciting, talking about different pots of capital across the pension spectrum actually working together. Listeners, if you want to make sure you never miss a future episode of the Professional Investment Podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button and do interact, comment, and take part in our polls. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks for being on the show, Tony.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Pleasure.